Welcome. My name is Leanne Schneider-Webb, and I'm an adult services librarian here at Bexley. My coworker Jeff is behind the Bexley Public Library username, and he will kind of be running things in the background. Alrighty, so this evening we have joining us George Peach for Native Plant Gardening and Landscaping. George Peach is an Ohio State University Master Gardener. He's with the Master Gardeners here this evening, so thank you for being here. He has gone through the Pollinator Specialization Program, the Ohio Volunteer Naturalist Program, and in its 5th year, he is the owner of Primary Nature Horticulture Landscaping. So thank you so much for being here with your expertise, George, and you can take it away.
Very good. Good evening. Let me get the screen up. There. Excellent. I'm pleased to be able to share this program with you this evening on native plants and sustainable landscaping. Prior to the meeting, you should have been emailed 2 documents. One contains an inventory of plants that we're going to discuss a little bit later in the program. Thought that might be a handy reference for you. The second document contains a lot of resources in the way of publications, websites, and so forth. As it turns out, this topic has become very popular, and it's become also very resource rich, so we're lucky. There we go. So why is there all this interest in native plants? To begin with, we need to understand that native plants are well adapted to the natural area in which they originally developed and currently grow. Once established, they pretty much take care of themselves and do not require a whole lot of effort and labor. They reduce our maintenance chores, and they also, more importantly, reduce inputs such as watering, fertilizer, and pesticides. They simply just don't require much pampering. A second major reason, I think, for the interest in native plants is they're seen as a very important vehicle to helping restore native ecosystems, many of which have been degraded, not outright destroyed. Native plants rebuild that ecosystem, and that's to the benefit of insects, birds, wildlife, and certainly to us humans. They're very critical to creating what we're calling sustainable landscapes. Sustainability also is a very hot topic right now. You hear it bandied about in all sorts of different professions. Frequently has a very heavy economic definition. One of the ones I think is pretty useful is that it satisfies the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs as well. We want to be able to enjoy the natural world now, but we also want to make sure that we don't erode it so that future generations don't equally enjoy it. Specifically, sustainability in landscape means that our sites are ecologically healthy and also biologically diverse. Very important that they're self-sufficient, and that translates into a lot of labor saving. Also important is that they are conserving of resources. And they also need to be aesthetically pleasing. One of the big raps against, I think, native landscapes is some folks have the impression that they are wild-looking, overgrown, weedy. And certainly they can be, but manicured landscapes can do that also. A well-designed native landscape, I think, is a great thing of beauty. So what exactly is a native plant? Natives are plants that have evolved naturally within a given area. One definition states that native plants are those plants that flourished in North America prior to the advent of European colonization. The area in question, the natural occurring area, may be something very big or something very small. It can be a portion of the state. It can be the entire Midwest. A lot of plants are native to the entire eastern United States, and there are a few that are native to the entire continent. Let me show you some examples of some native ranges. The red twig dogwood, which is a very popular landscape plant. The stray species of this plant is found very widely dispersed throughout North America. The eastern redbud tree takes its name from its prevalence throughout the eastern United States. Whereas the Ohio buckeye has a much smaller native area. It's not small, but in relative to the eastern United States. It's found in the lower Great Plains and Midwest. Then we have a plant like the Canaan Fir, which actually is a native plant. It will grow in central Ohio. It's native to isolated pockets in the Appalachians. It's not very widespread at all. In addition to talking about what regions plants come from, we should also pay some attention to the kind of growing habitats they come from. Different native plants are found naturally in very specific habitats throughout their native range. What that means is just because a plant's native to an area, it may not necessarily grow in all other habitats within that area. A plant that flourishes down on the Ohio River may not do well in your backyard here in central Ohio. So here's some examples of what we are talking about with regard to the term native growing habitat. There are prairies and meadows, which are very open, usually full sun. Can, in some situations, be very dry at parts of the growing season. There are woodlands. Most of our continent was covered by woodlands prior to settlement. There are woodland edges, which are kind of unique areas. They are on the edges of woodlands, so they get filtered light, and then parts of the day they may get full light. Sometimes that's a situation where wood meadows are butting up right next to a stand of trees. There are bottomlands. Bottomlands are areas around rivers, streams. They may be floodplains that maybe during parts of the year are very, very wet, and they may be even underwater for a great deal of time. And then other parts of the season, they may be very dry and very drought prone. And there are plants that are uniquely adapted to that. There are also wetlands, areas that are very wet, sometimes in standing water. They remain wet most of the season. So again, plants that flourish in these kinds of environments have what we call a tolerance to wet feet, and those wet feet being their roots. There are also some areas like rocky outcrops where there's not a whole lot of soil, and what soil there may not be very rich. So it takes, again, a special kind of plant to survive in that kind of growing habitat. Now, the good news is a good number of our native plants are pretty adaptive. So they actually do quite well in a number of different kinds of growing conditions. And those are the ones that have become popular in the nursery trade because they do so well. Okay, if a plant's not native, what is it? It's either non-native, sometimes called an exotic, or sometimes called an alien plant. These are plants that have come to us from other parts of the world. They've been either purposely or sometimes accidentally imported and introduced from other regions, other countries, or even the entire continent. The nursery trade has been very active over the past couple of centuries in bringing in plants from all over the world. Sometimes these plants have also been introduced for purely economic reasons. People are looking for plants to help control erosion. They're trying to find new crops, to provide fodder for their cattle, and so forth. A lot of the plants you see in landscapes, or traditional landscapes, have their origins in other parts of the world. There are a lot of nursery and landscape plants that come from East Asia, China, Korean Peninsula, Japan. And that area of the world is incredibly rich in horticultural diversity. We also have plants that originated in Europe. Asia Minor, the Caucasus, produce quite a few plants that have become common in our landscape trade. Central and South America. A lot of our garden annuals are actually native to Central and South America. Now, the real bad thing about some non-native plants is that they are considered invasive. They become invasive when they are introduced to our area, and then they take over, basically, and then they seriously outcompete native species. The photo on the upper right is of kudzu, which is a vine native to Asia. It was introduced right around the turn of the century, the early 1900s, as a tool to fight erosion. They thought it was an aggressive grower, which it was. It quickly became invasive, and it is a serious horticultural, ecological, and economic problem in a number of southern states. And it looks like it's slowly creeping northward with climate change. It's not currently in Ohio yet. Now, some native species are considered aggressive growers, but they're not necessarily invasive. And again, aggressive growers can be problems in certain situations, but in the right planting situation, they can be perfectly great landscape plants. Another consideration too, when you're out shopping for native plants, is that certain plant genera have evolved with multiple species that have evolved and currently grow in different areas of the world, different continents. I'll give you an example. If someone tells you, one of the better smelling, more fragrant plants I've ever had is a mock orange, so you decide, I'd like to have a mock orange. You go to a nursery and you ask for a mock orange. Be very careful because you want to read the label, and most labels will give you the genus and species name. They may not tell you the plant origin, but at least if you know the species, you can start to do some investigation. The mock orange is part of the Philadelphus genus, and there are multiple species around the globe. In this country, you're likely going to be given a Philadelphus coronarius, which comes from Asian minor. There is a U.S. native plant, the P. indorus, and there's also one from Japan. But a number of these are found in the western U.S. as well. Now, some of those western varieties may not be suitable for Ohio just because of how different our climates are. Plants that are developed for the trade frequently are developed into what are called cultivars. And that simply means that they are a cultivated variety. And then those plants are typically selectively bred from natural occurring varieties or aberrations in the straight species plant growth. Very popular plants are developed as cultivars to give us better flower color. Maybe it's to make the plant smaller. Maybe it's to make it more cold hardy. So there are some practical benefits to this practice. Now, native cultivars have been given the name nativars, and there are folks out in the horticulture world who view their native gardens very strictly, and they would never include a nativar. They want only straight species in the gardens, and that's perfectly fine. What you're going to find, though, is that many of the quote-unquote native plants you find in the nurseries are, in fact, cultivars of straight species. And there are also hybrids. Hybrids typically result from a very determined cross-fertilization between two plant species or varieties. In rare occasions, they've actually been able to cross plants from different genera to produce new nursery plants. Now, it's interesting to note that hybridization can occur naturally in the wild. An example of this is oak trees in the red oak group are notoriously promiscuous and hybridize very freely. So when you go out to do, for example, tree inventories, you'll see something that you're pretty sure is a red oak, but it can be a real chore to figure out what exactly species it is. Chances are it's a hybrid. So let's walk through and take some look at just a representative sampling of native plants that will do well in Central Ohio, and also plants that should be readily available. And let's start with some trees. Let's start with some big trees. Oaks are great plants for a whole host of reasons. They're very hardy. They are great components of our natural ecosystem. Many different species all around the world, several species native to North America. They tend to be very large, although there are varieties that get very shrubby. In some cases, the same species will have different growth habits in different parts of the country. The real nice thing about oaks is if you're into pollinator gardening, you want to try to find room for an oak in your site. Oaks host over 500 species of Lepidoptera, butterflies, and moths. Now, there are two groups, major groups within the oak family. One are the red oaks, and the other is the white oaks. And depending on their heritage, species are assigned to one of those two groups. I'll give you an example of each. The northern red oak is a very common tree, a very large tree. You'll find it there's probably one on your street if you go out and take a walk. They can get up to 75 feet high and wide. Oak trees will spread very wide typically if they're not hemmed in and don't have to compete with a lot of other trees. Now, our street trees are planted pretty closely together, so that forces them to have more of an upward growth habit. They like full sun. They're very durable, long-lived trees. They can live 200, 300, 400 years if they are in a good spot and are treated well. Acorns produce a fruit that's known as the acorn. We've all seen these. Now, the red oak group produces a crop of acorns every 2 years, whereas the whites produce a crop every single year. Red oaks are pretty pervasive throughout eastern North America. An example of the white oak group is the bur oak. I love this tree. I wish I had room on my lot for it. I don't. Quercus microcarpa. Again, it grows very large, similar to the red oak. Again, it needs full sun to really do well. It's a very adaptable tree. It tolerates drought once it's established. And like I mentioned before, you get an annual crop of acorns. Again, this is found out through the central and northern parts of the U.S. Another large tree, the shagbark hickory. I put this in here because this is you'll see this tree very commonly out in the woods, like if you go to nature preserves or metro parks, where there are large stands of wood. It's interesting because of its bark pattern. It's got this very loose, shaggy bark. It's very distinctive and easily identified because of that. This plant will take a little bit of shade, but it would prefer full sun. Likes rich soil and moist, well-drained sites. Produces nuts that are really favorites of wildlife. Again, widely native to most parts of eastern North America. Okay, this is the last big tree I'm going to talk about, black cherry. If you've got a cherry in your site, it's probably more likely something from Asia, like a hybrid from Asia, a weeping cherry tree. They're very highly ornamental. This tree is probably not as ornamental, certainly, but it's still very elegant. It's an early spring bloomer. You get these very obvious flowering structures, and those will evolve into fruits later on in the season that are a favorite of birds and other wildlife. Again, this is widely distributed across a good whole swath of North America. Now, something a little bit smaller is a maple. There are, again, a number of native maple species. Red maple, sugar maple, which is a favorite because of its stunning fall colors, and silver maple, which is a tree that is not being planted quite so much because there are problems with it in terms of its structure, its longevity. But the red maple is a very hardy native maple tree. Grows a little bit smaller, it can get tall, but more typically it's going to be in the 40 to 50 foot range at maturity. Again, it's an early spring bloomer. As with a lot of large deciduous shade trees, it prefers full sun but will tolerate some part shade. Again, very prevalent in eastern North America. Here's a tree, the pawpaw, that is not that common in landscapes, but it's a really good, interesting plant. Again, it gets only about 30 feet high and wide, which makes it a good candidate for fitting into smaller urban and suburban lots. Early spring bloomer again. Again, it likes full sun, maybe a little bit of shade. The unique thing about this plant is it produces these good-sized edible fruits towards the end of the season. It also has a real interesting flower, kind of a deep burgundy color, which is a little unusual. Widely prevalent throughout the eastern U.S. as well. And again, let's get into some smaller things that might be more practical for our urban and suburban landscapes. If you have room for one tree, I would highly recommend the serviceberry. There are a number of species of serviceberries. There are some hybrids. widely available in the nursery trade. These trees don't get super big, 20 to 30 feet tall, and about as wide. What I like about these trees is you get a nice early bloom in April. It can be a very profusely blooming tree. And then by June, there's already a crop of ripened berries that have been produced. If you are a birder, or if you want to attract birds to your yard, this is a great plant simply because most everything else you're going to plant in your yard, a lot of your woody plants, they're going to be producing berries later on in the season towards the fall. This is a nice little extra for the birds early on in the season. And what happens, and actually these berries are edible too. I know folks who like to go in there and pick them and make jams and so forth with them. The only issue is you have to beat the birds to the fruit, because once they discover the right fruit, and the squirrels love the fruit also. That tree will be picked clean. Again, widely prevalent in eastern North America. Continuing with more ornamental varieties, again, a smaller tree is the flowering dogwood. Again, there are a lot of dogwoods in many different habitats throughout the world. This is native to a good hunk of eastern North America. It's, again, 20, 30 feet high and wide. Again, these are very prevalent. You'll see them all over central Ohio. And there are two prevalent bloom colors. One's the pink and one's the white. Now, what you think is the flower is actually a bract. The flower on this plant is actually that small green thing in the center of what looks like the flower. Those are the real flower buds. The white and the pink structures around them, that's actually a modified leaf called a bract. And that's what gives it essentially its visual appeal. You also get little red berries in the fall. Eastern redbud, another really spectacular tree, extremely easy to grow. They self-seed, so if you've got a female specimen in your yard, you probably are always pulling up seedlings year after year after year, because they set really, really heavy seed. That's because they set really heavy flowers. The flowers on this tree actually are connected to the stems and branches rather than like a panicle structure. So you will see blooms throughout the wood canopy structure of the tree. These bloom early in spring, not particularly fussy about light. They're considered in some areas an understory tree, so they will take some shade. In fact, in some situations, might take a fair amount of shade. But they also do very well in full sun. Now, this is a plant that the plant breeders have had a lot of fun with. I'm just showing you here some of the many varieties you can get. These cultivars of eastern redbud have been bred for different flower colors, different leaf colors, different forms and habits, growth habits. We've got one picture showing the white flower version. The lavender twist is a weeping version, so it grows down in a weeping pattern, similar to what you see in some weeping cherries. Ruby Falls is another weeping variety. The leaves on this plant, this particular cultivar, however, gets so dense you would never know it's weeping. And one of my favorites is the Rising Sun. This is a tree a little bit smaller than the straight species, but it sends out new leaves with kind of a pinkish orange color. Those leaves turn to yellow and then they turn to green. The cool thing about this tree is, because leaves are constantly merging throughout the growing season, you usually have all three colors on the tree at the same time. And let's also mention evergreens. I'll show you a couple examples here. A very large evergreen is the eastern white pine, Pinus strobus. This is a conifer, which means it does not produce a flower, but rather it produces seeds inside cone structures. Again, it likes full sun for the most part. Will tolerate a little bit of shade. They get pretty big, get pretty tall when they're mature. They're not the fastest growing plants. The one notable characteristic of the white pine is it has these really long, soft white needles, and visually it can have a really delicate look despite the size of the tree. Very prevalent throughout the eastern U.S. and also up into Canada. Another nice native is the hemlock. And again, it's smaller than the white pine, anywhere from 40, 50, 60 feet tall. It has very dense foliage, which gives it a really nice eye appeal with very graceful lateral branching. This tree is very useful in landscape design because if you have a spot where you'd like a good sized tree, but you also have a lot of shade like other more mature trees around, this plant will tolerate part shade, if not even a little bit of full shade. Again, very widely prevalent throughout eastern North America. Now, I'll warn you, there's a problem with this tree. There's a pest called Hemlock woolly adelgid. It's not a problem in our area yet, but it has decimated hemlock forests on the east coast of the United States. There is a small pocket of infestation down in the Hocking Hills that they have identified and seem to be successfully controlling. I would not let that stop you from buying one of these trees and putting it in your landscape, however. Let's also now take a look at some smaller shrubs and one vine. There are a number of viburnums available on the market. And again, this is a plant that's widely distributed throughout the world. A lot of the stuff you see in the nursery trade are from Asia, but we do have some native varieties too. An example here I'm showing you is the Arrowwood Viburnum. Now, viburnum plants tend to get very, very tall. Now, there's some smaller cultivars. There's a few species that stay small, but they all tend to get like 8, 10, 12 feet tall and wide. The Arrowwood Viburnum, depending on where you grow it, can get tall, but it doesn't necessarily spread out all that wide. It's got very, very straight stems. That's why it gets its name. Again, it produces this typical white viburnum bloom in late spring, early summer. And the viburnums produce berries in the fall. Sometimes they're red. This species produces, when it's mature, a blue-black berry. Again, a favorite of birds. Pollinators love those flowers in the spring. The ninebark shrub is native. Now, the native plant is somewhat plain. It doesn't have a particularly large and obvious flower, but it's a pleasant looking flower. It has a nice looking foliage structure to it, however. When you find this plant in the nurseries, what you're going to find are a lot of cultivars that have been developed for leaf color. And that's why people like this plant. You can get varieties that are kind of an orangish leaf, burgundy, red, just light green, dark green. And that's why it's so popular, just to give some interesting foliage. Again, this plant is pretty widely distributed throughout the eastern United States in its straight species form. American elderberry, this is not a common landscape plant, but it's becoming more so. Again, for people who want to attract birds and pollinating insects, it's a great bird plant. It can get pretty big, 5 to 12 feet tall. There are cultivars that shrink that size down. And there are cultivars that have slightly varying leaf colors as well. This is a summer bloomer. Again, this is a nice time of year to have a plant producing, getting ready to produce berries. Pretty much you need full sun for this plant. Will tolerate some shade. Plants that are listed as full sun, part shade, the difference is you're probably going to get a bigger, more robust plant in full sun. You're probably going to get a better flower and fruit set in full sun. The red twig dogwood, very popular landscape plant owing to its winter interest. In the winter, a lot of our deciduous plants drop their leaves, and unless they have real interesting stem structures, branch structures, there's not going to be a whole lot to add ornamental value to the landscape. These plants, because of their color and because of the density of their twigs, are very popular. The straight species has usually a very dark red stem, can almost be approaching purple, it's so dark. There are cultivars that have been bred to brighten up that red. You can also get it in kind of orangey red versions, and there's a yellow dogwood on the market as well. These get 6 to 9 feet tall. They'll actually probably stay a little bit smaller than that in most landscapes. This is an oddball. I threw it in here just to show you what your potentials are if you get into some serious native gardening. This is a button bush. It's got a very unique flower head. This is a plant that really needs a wet site. You could probably grow it on a drier site, but you probably need to give it some supplemental irrigation. You'll see it around the edges of ponds and other areas that stay fairly moist throughout most of the growing season. Again, this plant is found in a lot of areas of North America. Red chokeberry, again, a great birding plant if you want to produce berries for the birds. This tends to get tall, but not particularly wide. There's also a version called, it's a different species, it's called black chokeberry, and the principal difference is instead of red berries at the end of the season, you get blackberries at the end of the season. The birds aren't picky, they'll go after both. Spice bush. This is an interesting plant. It's got a kind of an interesting, small, interesting yellow flower that blooms pretty early in the spring, and then towards the end of the season, you'll get small red berries. Again, very prevalent in the eastern United States. I planted one in my landscape a couple of years ago. It's starting to get pretty big. Some of the hydrangeas you see in the nursery center, and you'll see a lot of them, are not native, or they've been hybridized so much that the parentage is starting to get lost. If you want a true native, you want to look at a plant like Hydrangea arborescens, the smooth hydrangea. These are nice for a native. This is a pretty compact plant. Only gets at the most maybe 5 feet high and wide, and because of its size, it offers a lot more opportunities for use in your landscape. You get later season blooms on this, starting in June, going through September. Very typical of the hydrangeas. The Oakley Hydrangea, which I did not include in this program, is also a very good staple native landscape hydrangea. It gets pretty good size, has interesting leaf color, and again blooms later, like in midsummer, and then towards the summer the blooms actually turn a different color. Real interesting plant. This will take some part shade. In fact, if you stick it out in full sun all day long, it will not do well probably unless it gets lots of water. Beautyberry. Again, this is not super common in our landscapes, but it's a real visually interesting plant. Again, a little bit more compact. It's maybe 6 feet tall. It blooms in midsummer, and then towards the fall, the blooms turn into these very interesting looking small purple lilac berries that are produced in clusters on the branches. Again, birds do go after these pretty aggressively. There is also an Asian beautyberry that's sold commonly in our landscape nursery trade, so you do have to pay attention to the labels. And winterberry holly. This is not a evergreen holly, it is a deciduous holly, so it does drop its leaves in the fall. But again, it's popular because it produces a lot of red berries that tend to persist through your winter, depending on how aggressively it's browsed by the birds and or deer. But usually it's a plant that gives you a burst of color throughout the winter. And then by spring, those berries will all be gone. Now this plant requires, if you want those berries, both a male and a female plant, so that the male plant can pollinate the female plant. It doesn't, if you plant a grouping of these, you can plant 4, 5, 6 females to one male, and they will all be adequately pollinated, so you'll get a great berry crop. And let me show you one vine too. The trumpet honeysuckle. There are numerous honeysuckle species that have gotten a really bad rap and deservedly so. They're aliens. They're not native plants, and most of them can be very aggressive, if not invasive. They just take over. This plant is much better mannered It does require something to grow up on, although you can let it just sprawl and grow almost like a ground cover. But most people like to train these up on a fence or some kind of structure. Left to its own devices, and if it likes where it's growing, it will get up to 15 feet long. It stays much more narrow, 3 to 6 feet wide. If it does outgrow your trellis or your fence, it will simply flop over and grow down to the ground again. You'll still get that great floral display. Hummingbirds love this plant because of the tubular flowers. They'll be all over this summer in bloom. The bloom time here is what's made of June, but I've seen them bloom much later into the summer. This originally comes from the southeastern U.S., but as you can see here, it's been pretty widely introduced, and therefore it has become naturalized in many other areas of the eastern United States. And let's take a quick walk through some perennials. Some of these plants you're probably much more acquainted with because they're pretty popular in garden centers. An early spring bloomer is the native columbine. There are also lots of hybrid columbines on the market, but if you want a native, this is the one I would go for. It blooms very early in the spring. It's listed as full for part sun. I've seen these grow in pretty shady conditions. Sometimes if you go out to nature preserves, you'll see these growing out of crevices and rock faces. You look at them and you wonder what they're growing in because you certainly don't see much soil. I'll show you two milkweeds too here. The first being butterfly weed. This is a very small milkweed. Stays low to the ground, maybe 2 feet tall once it's developed and established. This blooms early summer into midsummer. Very drought tolerant to poor soils. Once it gets established, it does well. And let me say something about establishing new plants too. Even if a plant is listed as drought tolerant, in its first year or maybe two in the ground, it's not going to be all that drought tolerant. So you are going to coax it along a little bit, maybe give it some supplemental irrigation during really long periods of hot, dry weather. But again, once they get their roots established and that root growth gets down into the ground, they become incredibly durable. A larger milkweed is the swamp milkweed. And again, this is the one that's I would plant if you want to promote monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies use this as a host plant. You'll see monarch butterflies feeding on a lot of different plants, but milkweeds are the only plants that they will actually lay eggs on and let their larvae develop. The larvae will hatch, or eggs will hatch, the larvae will then grow and develop eating the leaves of milkweed. I like this plant over the common milkweed. I think it's got a little bit nicer, refined look to it and the leaf structure and so forth. And it's got these great pink flowers. The common milkweed, in some jurisdictions, not this plant, but the common milkweed is considered kind of a pest weed. And it's actually, in some municipalities, it's controlled, you can't grow it. That attitude is starting to change now that people realize the value to wildlife, especially the pollinators of the common milkweed. It used to be found out in the countryside, along roads, along ditches, at the edges of farmer fields. It would grow wild there. And then that habitat has been severely reduced through spraying and so forth. Purple coneflower, that all of you have at least one of these plants in your yard. Again, a very hardy, very adaptable plant, tolerates drought, heat, humidity. Bloom time is June to August usually, and it's not really quick to emerge from the ground in the spring. If you plant one last fall and it doesn't come up by April, you might think you lost it. You just be patient; it's still coming. This plant has a lot of different cultivars. In fact, I'll show you two here in a minute. But it's a native to eastern North America. Pollinators love it. Small birds, seed-eating birds, will pick at it in the fall. This plant has been pretty heavily hybridized in the past 5 to 10 years. Not all of these cultivars are hardy necessarily. And in fact, the industry promotes some of these more as annuals rather than perennials, which I think is so unfortunate. But there are some of these cultivars are hardy. They will come back year after year. And they give you a variety of color. There's oranges, reds, yellows, whites, The last one there on the right is something I would steer you away from. There are these double flowering cultivars that have a lot, really high high ornamental value, but very difficult for pollinators to get in there and take advantage of that flower head. Culver's root is something you should look at. It's a very different kind of plant for our gardens. It gets kind of tall. One thing the nursery industry does is they tend to hybridize plants, among other things. In addition to getting color and maybe a different leaf form, they hybridize plants to make them smaller in the garden, which is unfortunate in some cases. This plant is a nice tall plant, good for the middle or the back of your flower bed. It sends up really interesting flower spikes that range in their native form from white to kind of a pale blue. It needs full sun. Black-eyed Susan, again, you probably have one of these or more of these in your yard. Very popular plant. Again, it's very tolerant, very adaptable. That's why people like to grow them. Nice burst of color through most of the summer. And it self-seeds pretty heavily, so it's going to produce more plants for you. If you have a wet site, this is a very good plant, cardinal flower for the wet site. Again, it is a midsummer, mid to late summer bloomer. It will take some shade, but it really needs the wet soil. If you put it on a dry site, again, it's going to require supplemental irrigation. And it's just the Agastaki genus has a lot of species, and again, they're widely distributed throughout the world. This is a native variety, very nice hardy plant. It gets 3 to 4 feet tall. Blooms a little bit later in the season. Full sun to part shade, I'd put it in full sun probably. Blazing star, there are a number of Liatris species in the United States. This one is the one you are most likely to find in a garden center or nursery. Some of the native plant nurseries carry the other species as well. But again, this is a pretty nice plant. Towards the end of the season, this plant will die back and won't be the most attractive looking thing going into the fall. But there is a cultivar, actually there's several cultivars. One produces a white flower, but there's the most popular cultivar of this is a much shorter plant, maybe 18 inches to 2 feet tall. Mountain mint. If you're a serious pollinator gardener, I would suggest you install at least one of these in your garden. This is not a very common garden landscape plant, but it really, really brings in the pollinators. Again, drought tolerant, mid to late summer bloomer. And to get something that blooms in the fall, we need to start looking at things like the New England Aster. Again, this is a very durable, useful plant. It gets kind of tall. There again are cultivars in the Simplotrichum genus. So you can get plants that vary sometimes in bloom time, sometimes in flower color, size of plant, and so forth. The nice thing about this plant is it just covers itself. Once it's established, it covers itself with blooms. Another fall bloomer is the Goldenrod. A number of Goldenrod species are available. I just sort of picked this one out of the hat to follow back over the so. Again, this is a nice plant for pollinating insects, simply because by this time, like when you get to late summer, early fall, the variety of flowering plants starts to diminish. And so our pollinating insects have to work a little bit harder for nutrition. And I'll show you a grass and also a sedge plant here. This is little blue stem. And I'm showing you this plant because among the ornamental grasses, it's one that's a little bit smaller. Some of our ornamental grasses just get ginormous. It varies in growth, 2, 3, 4, 5 feet tall. Again, you want to put this in full sun. It sends up, you may not think of them as such, but it sends up flower spikes. They're very typical of grass flowers. You get those late summer, early fall. Once it's established, it's really, really drought tolerant. And this is a sedge. Sedges are grass-like plants, but they're a little bit different. Sedges tend to be smaller. The nice thing I like about sedges is a number of them will tolerate part, if not full shade. This Appalachian sedge, you could probably plant in full shade all day long, and it will do okay in that condition. It's a soil adaptable, but to get it established, you want to make sure it stays well watered. And let me show you a couple of ferns also. Again, these are great choices for woodland gardens or shady spots in your yard. The cinnamon fern is a native, gets 2 to 3 feet tall. The interesting about this plant is the rusty colored spike it puts up. Good for wet sites, although I would say it's probably fairly adaptable in terms of moisture. A smaller, a little more delicate fern is the maidenhair fern. Again, it'll go in the same kind of light conditions, part to full shade. This plant prefers moist, acidic soils, and if you put it in alkaline soils, probably not going to do a whole lot. Okay, we've looked at some plants, and by no means is that an exhaustive list of native plants. You have a lot of variety to choose from. But let me talk a few minutes about how to get a native garden established. Most of us are working with established landscapes of one sort or another, so we're not going to be digging everything up and just recreating a native garden from scratch. We're going to be renovating what we have. What I would suggest you do if you're serious about introducing native plants is, first of all, scope out what you've already got and evaluate the condition of your existing landscape plants. There may be things in there that could be removed if they're beyond their prime, or maybe possibly relocated or possibly given away if you really don't want them. Take a good long look at the light patterns your landscape gets to, and chances are the light's going to change throughout the course of the day as the sun passes over the sky. But pay attention to what areas get a lot of sun, which areas don't get quite so much. Full sun is rated as at least 6 hours a day of direct sun contact. Part sun is 4 to 6 hours, and part shade is under 4 hours. You may have situations under trees where you get not full sunlight, but you get filtered sunlight or dappled sunlight. And again, that brings in a fair amount of solar radiation, surprisingly so. I would suggest you also take a look at your soil quality. You may even want to go as far as getting a soil test. Those are available usually through cooperative extension services, and some private labs also do soil testing. One thing you can do is just take a shovel out to your landscape and dig down, take a look at what you've got. If you're lucky, you've got soil that's a loam with high organic content, but likely you don't have that. You more likely have something that's fairly heavy in clay. If it's a lawn area, it's been pretty seriously compacted over the years, and that will have an effect on what you can plant unless you choose to do some soil amendment. You also want to figure out what your water conditions are on site. How well does the soil hold water? Do you have unusual drainage patterns? Are you prone to flooding in the spring? That can have a huge effect on plant life. Next, you want to sort of make a plan. Figure out what you need in your yard. Do you need trees? Do you have enough trees? Do you need to get some smaller woody plants in there? Do you have a lot of sunny areas, you'd like to include some perennials, some herbaceous perennials. And then figure out what things do you really like. This is important. Like, what kinds of plants do you really like? What appeals to you? What are you attracted to? And then take those plants and then try to match them to the kinds of growing conditions and habitats you have in your yard. And then you get to do the fun stuff to start planting. Obviously, you want to do any serious soil amendment work prior to planting. You can either do that for a whole bed, or you can do it in small areas around specific plants. Maybe you're planting a shrub, and you want to, in a 2 or 3 foot area around the shrub, improve that soil. Needless to say, if you're planning any construction, like hardscape work, walkways, patios, decks, or other structures, that work you really want to get done before you do any planting, if it's anywhere near your planting area, your proposed planting area. And then just start planting and beginning to build your landscape. You may have just a few things you want to put in. You may have very ambitious plans. Most of us work on a budget, so you may need to phase in that work over several seasons. So quickly, where do we find garden plants? Because of the growing popularity of natives, general garden centers and nurseries are increasingly carrying things, but you won't be overwhelmed probably with a selection quite yet. You more likely will encounter native cultivars than straight species, but that's slowly starting to change. There are specialty nurseries out there that are specialty in the way of promoting native plants. In Ohio, I think there are probably 10 listed nurseries that are native plant specialists, and we have 2 or 3 fairly close to Columbus. Obviously, you can order, do mail order plants and seeds. If you like to grow seeds, seeds are a great way to get natives growing in your yard. Very economical as well. Plant sales and auctions, keep your eye open for these. A lot of botanical gardens will have these, garden clubs will hold these. Up until the pandemic, Chadwick Arboretum at Ohio State had a huge May plant sale every year. It's a great place to go and get really good quality plants too. You also be surprised what you can get from your friends and neighbors. If you have folks you know who are serious perennial gardeners, they're going to be dividing their plants as they grow and get big. So it might be an opportunity for you to get some plants from them and possibly set up an exchange. One thing you seriously do not want to do is go out in the wild and start digging up plants in the wild. 2 reasons for that. One is you're obviously reducing the native ecosphere. And secondly, it could very well be illegal for you to be doing that. We have certain native plants that are protected throughout the state. It's illegal to do anything with them. Also, certain organizations, certain park districts are very much control what you can and cannot do with regards to species removal. Most of them say without a permit, you cannot remove things. The metro parks, for example, if you go out and dig a plant out of the metro parks, you're going to get a fine and you're going to pay a big fine. Now, seed collection may be okay, but again, it's always wise to check with the property owner or the park district to make sure that's a permissible activity. There is a website called Plant Native, and again, this is listed on one of your handouts, the web address, that among other things has a native plant nursery finder, and it's by state. So you just click that, go to your state, and it tells you where the native plant nurseries are. And a quick word too about just general cultural practices, and by this we mean, how do you maintain and take care of your garden? Some quick principles are, and this is the mantra of landscapers and horticulturists, that is only use the right plants in the right places. Don't try to force a plant that needs a certain kind of growing condition into an environment that lacks that growing condition. Don't put a wetland plant out where it's going to be hot and dry all summer long. I would strongly suggest you diversify your landscape. There have been some studies to indicate that landscapes with higher plant diversity tend to do better at maintaining themselves with less human inputs. You want to limit or avoid certainly pesticide use that can have a harmful effect on pollinating insects. Water and fertilize appropriately. Watering is one of the areas where most of us sort of fumble around when we're first getting started in gardening. If we don't totally neglect the plant's water needs, we go out there and drown it. Also, too, you want to foster good air circulation. This helps keep plant disease pressures down. When you have plants grouped closely together or packed close to your house or a fence line where there's not a lot of wind or air circulation, that's a good breeding ground for fungal diseases. And then also, too, I would suggest that you get into the habit of periodically scouting your landscape for disease or insect problems. Just get out there and see what's going on. Plus, it's a great opportunity to enjoy the fruits of your labor, to see what you planted, how it's changed its growing season. If you do encounter an insect infestation or a budding disease problem, it's going to be much easier to deal with and solve if you catch it early versus if you catch it much later in the day. Just last week, I was out on a client site. They had a small evergreen shrub, and the owner said, "Why are all the stems white on this plant?" And I looked at it, and it was covered with scale insects. You could not see the color of the stem for all the scale insects. And they're very hard, once they develop their armored body, they're very hard to get rid of. And my recommendation, unfortunately, is that she pull the plant. Had she caught it earlier, she could have treated it. I haven't talked about lawns either, but let's talk about lawns. The turf we put down, most of us, really does very little to support anything going on in the natural landscape. If you have Kentucky bluegrass in your lawn, guess what? It's not native. It comes from Europe. Where you're growing grass, you could actually be growing other plants that have much more value to the native landscape, and probably add a lot more interest to your yard. I'm not recommending that you go out and tear up every square inch of your yard, but you might want to consider starting to selectively remove portions of your lawn and replace that lawn with something that's a little more interesting in the way of planting. Okay, quickly, let me share some information resources with you. If you want to learn, there's a lot of stuff out there. Websites of cooperative extension services. Ohio State is a wonderful resource. They have a lot of things online, as does Michigan State. I've used Cornell extensively. Penn State also. Penn State has a big turf program if you're into that. I've also used Purdue in Illinois. Every land-grant college across the United States is going to have this kind of resource to one extent or another. There are two botanical gardens that have websites I would direct your attention to. One is the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center at the University of Texas. They list a lot of plants and give you a lot of information on specific plants by genus and species. Also, the Missouri Botanical Garden. This is my go-to site if I need a quick reference on just about any plant on the face of the earth. It's just got a huge web inventory of plants. It gives you not super detailed information on everything, but it gives you a good overview of the major culture requirements, where it comes from, when it blooms, and how, what landscapes it works best in. We have native plant societies that also have very useful websites. We also have, as here with the Pollinator Partnership and the Nursery Society, these are insect-oriented organizations that nonetheless spend a lot of time talking about native plants. This is a site you have, when we get done with the program, I want you all to go and dial up this URL and take a look at this website. Audubon launched several years ago a native plant database, and it's really easy to use. You go on the site, you key in your zip code, and it takes you to an inventory of plants that are suitable for your area. It's just a really useful tool. Similarly, the National Wildlife Federation is developing a very similar kind of website. It's currently in beta testing, but again, you might want to take a look at this again to find a good reference, good quick reference for good native plants for your area. Government agencies also can be useful. I know the USDA, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service have different kinds of interests in the native plant realm, but again, they may be worth looking at. The Ohio Department of Agriculture rides herd on invasive plants. They publish a prohibited invasive plants list, and it was just recently updated a couple of years ago. It's getting bigger. But currently, there are about 30 species on that list that you cannot buy or sell, or I don't think you're even allowed to give them away if they're growing on your landscape. Needless to say, we have plenty of invasives already in place, and most of them like the spread. Soil and water conservation districts, there's usually a district in every county. I know in Ohio, and I would assume throughout a lot of the other states, they have similar organizations. These can be very useful reference points for native plants, particularly rain gardens. They do a lot of work with water problems, water drainage, so they are very big advocates of installing rain gardens in websites. Books, lots of good books, a lot more coming out all the time. I would strongly recommend Bringing Nature Home by Doug Callany. Doug is a entomologist by training. I think he works at the University of Delaware, but he's become a leading evangelist for native plants and restoring our native ecosystems. He is actually in Columbus fairly frequently, so if you keep your eyes open, there might be an opportunity to actually go hear him in person. He's a really, really good speaker. Likewise, you're going to find a lot of information in garden magazines, some of which, and some of the plant societies actually produce their own periodicals. And also, again, going back to the cooperative extension services, there's a lot of publishing in most of these universities, specific papers up to full-scale publications. So I'm finished with our program, and I'd just like to leave you with a thought. As you begin transforming your landscape, simply remember that nature is not a place to visit, but it is home.
Thank you so much, George. And so we will just transfer right over to the questions.
Okay.
So we will stop sharing your screen. Jeff will go ahead and share the screen. And we'll get those participant questions. And was there a specific, we had some people in the comments, they were talking about Chadwick's. I know I've had some luck at Oakland Nursery getting some native plants. Did you have a specific actual like store? I think you had mentioned Chadwick's, but was there anything else that you wanted to just like quickly, if there was a specific store that's really convenient to the people in Columbus?
Okay, if you don't mind a little bit of a drive, there's a nursery called Sciota Gardens Landscape Nursery. It's in Delaware, on the west side of the city of Delaware. I would strongly recommend you take an opportunity to visit them. It's been around quite a while. It's just recently sold, but the people who bought them out are continuing a really good tradition of native plants, and actually they're building up the inventory. There's also another smaller nursery called Natives in Harmony. I believe it's up in Marengo, which is it's just up past Delaware on Interstate 75 a little bit.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so we'll get right into it. Will the cicada emergence affect tree planting timing this spring in Central Ohio?
No.
Okay.
The cicadas are going to feed on your trees. If we have a heavy emergence, which we likely will have, they'll take their toll on the aesthetics of the tree, but they're not going to do any long-lasting harm. The adults break out, and they have just like a very short period of time to mate, and they live maybe 2 weeks, and then they die off. That's why you see all the cicada corpses all over the ground.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good. What plants are best for a small raised bed?
How small is small? Okay, if you have a raised bed that's say 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, that's probably kind of typical. And if you're, number one, if you're going to plant some vegetables, I'd encourage you to do that. But I'd also encourage you to mix up vegetable plants with ornamental landscape plants. That can have a very nice look, and you get even extra utility out of your beds for doing that. But what I would do is probably, unless you're going to put a very, very small woody shrub in there, I would stick with perennial plants. Taller ones in the middle, shorter ones on the side, or going around it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Is witch hazel a native plant?
There is a native witch hazel, yes. In fact, I think there's a couple. We have witch hazels that bloom at different times of the year. They're useful because they actually are winter bloomers. They bloom so very early.
Wow.
And there's a variety that blooms in the fall too, but it's a great plant.
Okay. This is from my coworker from earlier today. She wanted to ask you, what should the library plant in its planters out front? They are large and concrete with no drainage, but they are in direct sunlight. So she said the soil is really soupy, but they're in direct sun.
Okay. Your biggest problem is the fact that there's no drainage.
Right.
If you have a drain container, your little planting will be more forgiving of watering problems or lapses. The fact that it's not drained, you have to be very careful about how much water you're putting in there. I would not just go out there and water because it's the third day during the week and you water every third day. Just go out and dig your finger down in the soil and see exactly how moist or not moist it is before you start watering. You might want to consider something that tolerates wet feet, like cardinal flower, or something that comes from more of a wetland or swamp environment. It may not be I think in those kinds of planters, usually they're filled with, profusely flowering annuals, and you want that floral display all summer long.
Yeah.
So the main issue for your planter is just you have to really be very careful about how you're watering.
Okay. Well, we don't do that. So hopefully maybe we can get them to not water it as much. Is there any, okay, so I think that was the last question on our slides, but we did have another one in the chat. How much manure is appropriate to put in a flower bed? Is it likely to get too much? Will it help grow flowers if mine keep dying off?
Well, your flowers may be dying off for a whole host of reasons. You're wise to attend to your soil quality. Again, what I would do is try to evaluate your soil quality, maybe get a soil test. But rather than manure, even composted manure, I would use a product if you want to build up your soil, like leaf compost. I think it's my go-to amendment. It's readily available. You can make your own. If you break your leaves the fall, chop them up and throw them in a compost pile. Usually it takes 8 months to a year for them to turn into workable soil amendment. I've used leaf compost anytime I have, let's say, a landscape plant that we're doing an install with who has horrible clay soil. We go in there and aggressively amend with leaf compost and usually get really, really good results. Occasionally, you just have to excavate the soil entirely and replace it with a higher quality topsoil, but you can do a lot with amendments. I don't think you need manure. And if you're growing vegetables, or if you're growing annuals, you're going to probably need to feed them. Annuals are heavy feeding plants, so you're not going to have much if you go through the summer without giving them some fertilization at intervals through the summer. But that may be one of the reasons you're not getting good plant growth.
Okay, and can you purchase leaf compost, or is that something that you have to make yourself?
No, you can buy it. I buy it in bulk, so you need a truck, but you can also buy it bagged. Kurtz Brothers usually carries it bagged. So you just go up there and they accept retail customers as well as wholesale.
And where was that?
Kurtz Brothers. They have, they're a soil and stone products company. They have a plant down on South 71 by, I think, Greenlawn Avenue in that area. And there's one closer to us here in Bexley, up on Westerville Road and 270, just south of that intersection.
Okay.
It's very industrial looking, so don't be put off by that. Just drive up to the window and tell them what you want.
Okay. And so if anyone didn't, I sent out the PDFs that you sent me, so everyone should have those resources. If you didn't get that email, I will put my email in the chat. And you can always reach out to us by calling the library or reaching out on social media at Bexley Library. George, thank you so much for being with us here this evening. And thank you, everyone, all of the guests, for joining us. Thank you so much. And we hope to see you again soon.
Cool. Good night.
Thank you, George.